Okay, we can see a medallion with figures in the middle, and there are cartouches with inscriptions to either side. What about the design of the figures?
It's very much like manuscript art.
Exactly, yes. Are the figures naturalistic, or is there any kind of distortion?
Cubist.
What? Oh, well, okay. Our problem is that they are made of inlaid silver on top of brass, and they have details engraved in the silver. We can't see the details very well in this photograph because of the reflection, so it's not quite so naturalistic as it would be.
Their size might be aged how important they are. Well, they're certainly not naturalistic. That could be because of the medium.
They're elongated.
They look like
Yeah?
when they added S to the letters.
Oh, well, I mean, the faces don't have any of the details left in this detail, but I want you to look at the overall proportions in particular. If we go back to something like this, okay, the Khaju Kurmani manuscript that we were looking at, these elongated proportions are very much in the same style. So it's quite possible then that some of the painters who were responsible for designing manuscripts were also involved in the design of this kind of object. This particular shape, it's one that's associated also frequently with bowls from the province of Fars in the south of Iran, which is where we saw a couple of Inju manuscripts were produced. Now, there's something else which isn't on your handout here. What would this have been for? A Quran. This is a folding Quran stand. And it is one that is actually dated to... Oh, very good. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yes, yes. Well, you were there recently?
Yes.
Ah, okay. Because it's been closed for a very long time and the gallery's just recently reopened. Great, I'm glad you went there. Yes, that's one of their star attractions in the museum. Yeah, very good. Mm-hmm. It is. It's a superb piece of wood carving, so it is extremely memorable. It's dated to 1361, and it mentions that it was made as waqf, as an endowment for a madrasa, but the madrasa we haven't been able to identify in any of the sources. So we're not positive where it was made, but the name of the craftsman who signs it has the Nisba al-Isfahani, from the town of Isfahan in central Iran. And that's actually as good a guess as anywhere else, probably from the Muzaffarid period, in other words. We saw one manuscript that was made by the Muzaffarids who, after the fall of the Ilkhanids, were ruling over central and southern Iran, and they were ruling over this territory at the time. I've got a couple of details of the top, for instance. And there are...
It's huge.
Well, it is a very big piece, yes. It's surprisingly, I mean, it's about this height, isn't it? Yeah. So it's unusually large as well. So two kinds of treatment of the wood here. One is very dense carving. We have Allah written 4 times in this square on the top. But there's also a series of marquetry, which means wood inlay. In Iran, what they do is they put little strips of woods which they glue together, and then they cut them off at the ends so that you have a flat geometric pattern. And that's what you see in these little hexagons and polygons around the edge. Okay. But there's also more superb carving in the spandrels of the polylobed arch here. These kinds of flowers, where was the artist getting his inspiration from? What would he have been copying here? This one perhaps, and this one might be particularly distinctive. Yes, these are chinoiserie flowers based on Chinese prototypes. This is a bit like a Chinese lotus. This is quite like a Chinese peony. Very naturalistic interplay of the weaving of the stems of the flowers as well. Here there are the names of the 12 imams. So this was done for a Shi'i patron. The 12 imams, the Shia imams. And the decoration within the arch on the bottom is of a flowering shrub emerging from a vase that's supported on a stand. This is a very common motif which we'll see repeated later in tile mosaic in particular, particularly in the Timurid and Safavid periods. So we'll look at a couple of examples of pottery as well, which we'll also see partially reflected in tile work. So on your handout, there's a handout for today as well. After inlaid metalwork, there's written Lajvardina. That's it's a kind of Western term which is derived from the Persian word Lajvardin, which is the word for lapis lazuli. Now, the dark blue color in pottery, in fact, comes from cobalt, not from the inert stone, but the color is the dark blue. We don't know what this would have been called in Iran in Ilkhanid times. Lajvardina is just a modern dealer's term for it. But the dark blue you can see forms the base glaze. That would have been fired by itself. And then in a second firing, we're talking about overglaze painting here. They put different colors of gold, of white, sometimes of red as well, and they fire it a second time. The advantage of this is that you can get very fine details in the overpainting. And you fire it actually at a lower temperature in the second time, which means that it doesn't run together. The disadvantage is that the overglazed colors, because you don't fire them to a very high temperature, they remain matte instead of glossy. But you have to, if they fire it at a higher temperature, it melts and runs together. So the very fine details that you get wouldn't work. Yeah. And so there are, well, that was a plain bowl. This is an albarello, it's called. This kind of shape, it's one which usually held medical drugs of different kinds. And same dark blue background, white gilding and red overglaze painting on top of it. And then the other most common form of Ilkhanid pottery is one for which again we have just a dealer's name, which is Sultanabad. Sultanabad is a city southwest of Isfahan where many examples of this kind of pottery were found, but there aren't any medieval kilns there as far as we know, so we don't actually know where it was made. This is a simpler technique, underglaze painting, where you paint the surface of the bowl and then you put a colorless, transparent glaze over it and fire it all in one go. And the typical colors here are this kind of monochrome gray. So what's depicted here? What are we looking at? Some kind of deer or gazelle, and what do we have around it? What? Yeah, it's a phoenix. This is the one with the long flame-like feathers, based on the Chinese model. Well, I think it's 4 different phoenixes, but it's not impossible. You're right that the artist could have thought of it as a bird flying round and round at different moments. Yeah, that's a possible interpretation. Good suggestion. And here's another one that has just the phoenixes with more elaborate tails. So these are obviously close to the ones that we saw in some of the paintings. Okay, we will move from this one to look at examples of architecture. And let's see, the the location of the buildings we're looking at. There are many of them around Tabriz. There is another major city that was founded by Ghazan Khan's brother Uljaitu, which was in Sultaniyya here to the southwest of the Caspian Sea, roughly close to the G of Gilan here. What else do we have? We have the Friday mosques in Varamin and Yazd as well. Varamin is quite close to where modern Tehran is, just south of the Caspian Sea. And Yazd is, Isfahan is in the middle. Yazd is a little bit further south, around about the E of Empire on that map. So, major patrons. Well, actually, the first patron that we're going to be dealing with is one who was not a Muslim. Abaka Khan ruled from 1265 to 82, and he built a palace at a place called Takht-e-Sulayman, which in Persian means literally the throne of Solomon. That's also in this same province of Azerbaijan, which is a little bit south of Tabriz and Maraghe. It's a fairly isolated area, but it's one where there had previously been a famous Sasanian fire temple. And the site was considered sacred, partially because there was a spring in the middle which bubbled up, forming a lake. The salts in the water condensed and formed a kind of wall around it. You can see the height of the lake is higher than the surrounding countryside. It's actually volcanic. There's an extinct volcano here visible in the background. In this part are the remains of the old Sasanian settlement, and the Ilkhanids built a new palace to one side. The fortifications around the outside are mainly from the old Sasanian period. So this is where the old Sasanian fire temple was, and here off to the side is where the palace was. It had Microrna decoration. There's not an awful lot left standing, but you can see some of the Microrna or stalactites in the niches on the side. What was most spectacular about it, though, was the tile decoration that they found when they were excavating here. So Nadeem, what technique would this tile be in? Yeah, what kind of overglaze, underglaze, monochrome, luster. These are all sorts of different techniques. This is an overglazed luster one. The kind of golden brown color that you see comes from the luster painting. Luster is a metallic oxide that is applied in a second firing in a reduced atmosphere. That means one which takes the oxygen out of the air. You can do this by burning wet wood, for instance, that produces a lot of smoke. And what that does is, if you have a metallic oxide, it takes the oxygen out and leaves the metal. So you have a very thin metal sheen on top. which gives it a very glossy, very lustrous appearance. I mean, hence the name that we have for it, luster. And this has, in addition to the common decoration of arabesques, it has some very interesting decoration in the spandrels. Not quite a unicorn. Anybody? Well, you have an animal with a couple of horns, but you have other animal heads as well. At least I don't know if donkey, maybe a camel. Different animal heads. Could be a rabbit. It's hard to be sure. But this actually is. There was a famous tree, a talking tree that Alexander saw on his travels, a mythological one, but it's referred to in Persian sources as the wak-wak tree. And in fact, the ability to be able to draw this kind of pattern was one of the tasks that was required of every capable artist. There are earlier examples of this in Seljuk metalwork, for instance, and it's found in later album paintings. And in addition, there were inscriptions in Persian with extracts from the Shahnameh. The Shahnameh, remember, we've seen illustrated manuscripts of it. It's the Persian national epic, and the verses relative to Alexander in it, as we saw in one of the manuscripts, may indicate that the Ilkhanids identified themselves with one of these foreign conquerors. This is also where, for the very first time in Islamic art, we get Chinese-style dragons appearing. What's the technique of this? Let's see. Nada. What technique is this? Big clue. We've seen one like it today already. Do you remember one with a dark blue background and with gold and red painting on top of dark blue? The first two examples of pottery we saw, the Lajvardina, had exactly the same color scheme. So this is another example of overglaze painting. So in addition to the Chinese-style dragon, we have Chinese lotuses as well. And now that you've seen this as well, by the way, well, let me just remind you of one of the manuscript paintings which had a very calligraphic dragon, quite similar to this in it.
The red looks brown.
The red, that could be just a color cast from the projector. Yeah, it's actually a brighter, more realistic red in my monitor. The problem is the balance of the colors in the projector, so it is a little bit off. Sorry about that. It is. This is, so Tafti Suleiman Palace is circa 1270 to 5. You have the dates there. The manuscript was about a century later. So this would have provided the model. Or at least there are common objects imported from China that could have provided the model for both of them, let's say. We don't know for sure. And this is just a fragment of a tile, but you can see clearly, I hope, what the main motif here is as well. A phoenix. This is another phoenix. The head would have been up here, but the body and the flame-like tail are very distinctive. And this is also one that is very obviously taken from Chinese sources originally. We'll come on to this in a second, but on your handout there's a mention of something built by Ghazan Khan in Tabriz again, which was the capital. Now he's, remember, the first Ilkhanid ruler who converted to Islam. And a kind of celebration of this was his building of a complex. What's a complex? Multifunctional amalgam of buildings of different kinds, yeah. And this is really exceptional because we have an unusual variety of types of buildings here that he built. We have a tomb, a congregational mosque, 2 madrasas, a khanqa, a dar al-siyada, we'll come back to that in a second, observatory, hospital, library, Beit al-Qanun, Dar al-Hikmah, an academy of philosophy, a house for the overseer, cistern and a bath. They've all disappeared, unfortunately. But they were particularly famous for their size, the tomb in particular. This was 12-sided. It was decorated with signs of the zodiac on the outside, and was one of the largest buildings of its day. Dar al-Siyada, what does that mean? You know what dar is in Arabic? A lot of the Persian terms are borrowings from Arabic. House or an abode, yes. A siyada in this case is... No, it's the plural of Sayyid. The house of Sayyids, the abode of Sayyids. It's a place, Sayyid in this case specifically refers to descendants of the Prophet. And they had special privileges. They were allowed to stay here with free accommodation and food for a certain number of days if they were just passing through. So that was another charitable bequest on behalf of the ruler. So sadly all that is gone. There's a little bit left of the next major institution that his brother Uljaitu built when he came to the throne. He decided to build a completely new capital city. Sultaniyya, the imperial, in other words, which was located a bit further south from Tabriz. Sadly, the location that he picked wasn't a particularly prominent one in terms of, say, being located on major trade routes or at crossroads. So after his death, it gradually started to decline. And today it's really just a little village, but with one major magnificent monument, his tomb, which still survives in good condition. What we're looking at here is a painting from a manuscript of travels of an Ottoman who accompanied one of the Ottoman sultans on his campaigns in Iran. And this was done in the 17th century. So it shows us what the city was like in the 17th century. It's not, of course, topographically completely accurate, but it gives us an idea of some of the most important features. The tomb itself is this building with the dome surrounded by minarets. Yeah, sounds unusual, isn't it? But that's what we're going to see, what the original was like. It was fronted by some kind of building with 5 domes and 2 other minarets. Maybe this was part of a palace, we're not quite sure. Off to one side seems to have been the Friday Mosque of the building. It had an entrance portal with 2 minarets. That also hasn't survived, but there's another French drawing of it in the 19th century which shows just the portal and the 2 minarets. So this part seems to have been a reflection of that, with a large Qibla dome chamber probably. There is a little mausoleum on one side, and we can see the walls that surrounded the town as well, and some other housing in between. Really the only thing that survives today is this enormous mausoleum. This is built on a gigantic scale, as you can see from the trucks and cars at the base. And this is the dome chamber that served as the mausoleum, or is beside the mausoleum. One thing that is apparent from this exterior view is the fact that it has upper galleries. Is there any particularly famous Islamic building you can think of that has galleries facing outwards? Building of the same function, in fact. Give me, one or two of the most famous Islamic monuments in the world. Taj Mahal, there you go. So this is, in a way, one of the first steps towards what led up to the Taj Mahal, the outer facing galleries. This is a new feature that wasn't seen earlier in any mausoleum architecture. The minarets have mostly fallen down, but you can see the stumps that surrounded it. It is an octagonal building, 8-sided, so there were 8 minarets. Judging from the previous drawing, which were probably at least as high as the dome, they may have been exaggerated in the painting. We're not really quite sure. But tall minarets surrounding it. This drawing perhaps gives a better idea of what the original size of them might have been. The exterior dome was covered in tile, and the interior nowadays has mostly painted plaster visible on it, or at least it was when this photograph was taken. But in fact, since this photograph was taken, they've started examining the structure more closely, and they have found that a lot of the plaster covers earlier decoration. There are 2 phases of decoration in the building. By the way, just looking at this with its 2 stories, where are the balconies that we saw on the outside in relation to what we see on the interior? Yeah. This is where the base of the balconies is here. There's a little window here, actually, which is at the height of the balconies. So it gives you an idea of the immense height of the structure. So here's one of these side walls, and you can see an inscription on painted plaster, geometric decoration. But here's a little area where they have cut away the plaster, and there's something underneath here. There's something underneath. Well, it's when you cut away all of the plaster, what you find is something like this. Magnificent tile decoration. In this case, it's composed both of plain unglazed brick tiles, of turquoise color glazed tiles, the actual that's the key question here. Why would they cover up such magnificent decoration with painted plaster? Because it's extremely high quality. They're using terracotta, in other words, molded pieces of brick to fill in some of the spaces between the tiles. I'll come back to that very shortly. This key question. Again, this is some of the decoration that they have uncovered after they removed the plaster. This is what was originally there. Again, a combination of unglazed brick, of simple light blue glazed strips of tile, and then terracotta decoration in between. But this is one of the earliest examples in Iran of tile mosaic, which is where you start off with plain monochrome glazed square tiles, and then you cut them together so that they fit like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle with no space between them. So the light and the dark blue, there's one smooth surface on top of these. And we'll see that the history of tilework in Iran is one where they add many more colors to this technique, and the designs become more and more complicated as a result as well. This is from one of the upper galleries, where again it was covered with plaster, but they've taken it away, and shows more of this wonderful design, combination of mostly light blue, but they also have dark blue. They're using the two colors. This kind of arch with a reverse curve towards the top. This is one possibly that is related to Chinese examples. This is called an Oji arch. That kind of reverse curve at the top. But it's also one that has a little kink in it halfway up. It's a pattern that actually starts in the Seljuk period, but this is what's called a broken-headed arch. And it remains typical of many Ilkhanid examples. So that's what we have in this little arcade running along the top here. The other area where there is spectacular decoration is in the outside galleries. Amazingly, despite the severe climate here, there is usually snow falling in winter, for instance. The decoration has survived remarkably well, even though it's made of stucco. Stucco, what kind of material is that? You know that term? Painted plaster. Or sorry, just stucco is actually carved plaster, but in this case it's painted stucco. It's carved and painted. Very elaborate patterns. There's an epigraphic medallion, a medallion with an inscription in the middle of it here. Geometric patterning around it. This kind of pattern is seen in some contemporary Quranic illumination, for instance. And here's a detail of another portion with Muhammad written in cursive in the middle. And I'm sorry again that the colors are a bit washed out here, but there's actually a dark green color that's used for the background here. So there's more color contrast than is shown on this particular screen. So, two phases of decoration. Both of them are from the reign of Uljaitu. It's not a case of there being original tile decoration and someone coming across along much later and adding this painted plaster on top of it. These are both actually, they have dates on them from Uljaitu's reign. The old explanation that used to be given was that he had planned this to be a mausoleum for Ali. He was going to take Ali's body from Najaf in Iraq. Uljaitu was Shia, unlike his predecessor Ghazan, who was Sunni. And the mausoleum was built for pilgrimage, but then at the end of his life he changed from being a Shia to being a Sunni, and so to cover up this change, he redecorated the building. But the problem with this interpretation is that there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever of it from the contemporary Persian sources. They don't mention any conversion to Sunnism at the end of his life. The first time we hear of it, in fact, is from an Ottoman traveller, Evliya Çelebi, in the 17th century. So it's unreliable. There's no good evidence for that. What may be of more relevance is that at the very end of his life, Uljaitu tried to gain control of the Hejaz, of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In fact, he sent one of his generals on an expedition to try and recover them from whom? Who would have been ruling over the Hijaz at this stage? Look at the dates. Okay. We have 1310, 1313 for the interior phase 1, 1316 interior phase 2. Yeah, so early 14th century. Who was in charge of the... Isabel, what did you... The Mamluks, exactly. They obviously weren't keen on the idea. And there were some skirmishes, but in fact he never actually was able to gain control of the Hijaz. But in the repainting, there are several Quranic verses which are relevant to the holy cities and to Jerusalem, which is where the third holiest shrine in Islam was. And in fact, this was the most obvious way of signaling to the community of believers a change in the orientation or the function of a building, the Quranic inscriptions that you had upon it. So this was probably a signal that he also wished to be seen as the term that was used for the Mamluks, the Khadim al-Haramain, the servant of the two holy sanctuaries, or their protector. And it underlined his imperial ambitions in this respect. But sadly, of course, it's something that was never, well, not sadly, but sadly for him, it was something that he was never able to accomplish. This is also on your, this is stucco as well. This is carved plaster. It's a mihrab, which is in the Isfahan Friday Mosque, and it's dated to 1310. So in fact, it's just a little bit earlier than the work on the Mausoleum of Al-Jaitu. And it's one of the most accomplished pieces of stucco design that we have. You can't see it that well from this overall picture, but I'll show you a detail of this area in just a second. The overall shape of one niche within a larger one is typical of Persian mihrabs and stucco mihrabs in particular. There's a large inscription around the outside. There's another one that actually occupies all of the tympanum here. Smaller one in Kufic. But this gives you a better idea of the quality of the carving. Magid, what's the, can you read any of the inscription here? Ali ibn Abi Talib. Okay. So this is the most legible part of the whole mihrab. This is at the top right, where the eye might fall normally. And we have the name of the first Shia Imam, okay, according to the Alids, the first caliph, the most important person. So this is, in fact, was a way of underlining Al-Jaitu's conversion to Shiism and proclaiming it to the population, or in this case particularly the population of Isfahan. That was the message, but it's also just a fabulous piece of carving. Just look at the layers, the depths that we have, both of the inscription, which is on top of the floriated scroll you have running behind it. You have a spiral, and we have leaves coming from it, and we have the stem of the spiral going behind the letters, behind some of the leaves on top of it, then through a leaf, behind the letters again, on top of some of the other scrolls. It's one of marvelous complexity. You can lose yourself trying to follow the details of the decoration here. And there's an interesting, for instance, open leaf form here, a kind of grill, a bulbous leaf form which has holes in it. Okay, both of you have done 206. What building in Cairo do we have that has stucco that looks like this one? Very good. The madrasa, actually, which is on Bain al-Qasrain next to the tomb of Qalun. Yeah. The mihrab of that has an open work boss and large bulbous leaf forms, which are very close to this. What's the date of that madrasa? Anyone remember? It's actually very close to this. It's 1295. This is 1310, so very much in the same period. And that's usually cited as an example of where they were copying Ilkhanid forms. Okay, let's look at then another building that is from the reign of Al-Jaitu, but it was by Vizier Zainuddin al-Mastari, and it has dates between 1303 to 1311. Natanz. You should have heard of this from recent news. What's Natanz famous for nowadays in the 21st century? Yeah, it's one of the places where Iran has centrifuges. So unfortunately that fame has eclipsed that of the magnificent shrine complex that was here. But it's actually one of the most beautiful mountain villages of Iran. I don't know how, I haven't been there since the nuclear facility was built, so I don't know how close it is, but probably not very. Okay, this is another complex, multifunctional grouping. It's also one that has a complicated building history because the first part of it, this dome chamber, which is octagonal and which has elements that suggest there was another octagonal area surrounding it. They uncovered a date recently equivalent to the year 999. So it's from the Buyid period, actually, a much earlier period. And that would explain, for instance, why it doesn't match up with the Qibla Iwan of the Friday mosque that was built around it. It's a very irregular plan here for a mosque. 4 Iwans by this time is the usual combination for an Iranian mosque, but the center of the Qibla Iwan doesn't even match up with the dome chamber behind it. So this was tacked on to this over time. There is an opening here, so you could go straight from the Qibla dome chamber into this, yes. Well, nowadays it's the Qibla dome chamber of a mosque, but originally the thought is that it probably was a mausoleum, this kind of octagonal form, particularly with an octagonal area around it, perhaps for circumambulation. Might have been for pilgrimage, and pilgrimage would be to a shrine or a place of burial of somebody particularly holy. So that's the most likely explanation. Now, there are, on this side of the complex, a mausoleum and a khanqa. Separating them, there is a street at this point, although in fact, if down here, there's a passageway into the mosque and there's another passageway to the outside here. So this seems to have been a kind of public right-of-way that went through the courtyard of the mosque. The sheikh here, Abd Samad, who's buried, this was probably his house when he was living and was teaching in the mosque. Mosques, of course, were used as much as madrasas for religious education. And after his death, as was common, he may have been buried in his house, but his followers, or the Ilkhanid vizier, built this mausoleum over the area, and khanqa for his supporters as well. This is what the main elements of the complex look like from afar. This is the Buyid dome chamber of plain brick that's dated to 999, which is now the Qibla dome chamber of the mosque. We see the pyramidal roof over what do you think this would be? The mausoleum. Yeah, this kind of pyramidal shape is common to tomb towers in Iran. Circular or polygonal mausoleums which have an emphasis on height, and that's typical of Iranian examples. And then beside it there is a minaret that was newly built, and just off to the left here, hidden by this enormous tree, is the Khanqa, of which only the entrance portal survives. And here they're also using the same colors in tile decoration that they were using in the Mausoleum of Al-Jaitu. We have unglazed brick, light blue and dark blue. And one of the interesting things about the tile work here is, in fact, the amount of different effects you can get using just these two colors, the light blue and the dark blue, with unglazed brick. We'll see more of that when we look at the entrance to the Khanqa. So that's the pyramidal exterior to the dome chamber, to the mausoleum. This is the interior. It's really spectacular. It's this wonderful example of a Microrna dome. No. This is the mausoleum. The Buyid one is on the mosque. This is the mausoleum. Yeah, they did. They put plaster on top of it. It's only when they removed the plaster that they found the date fairly recently. The Microrna stone, which has 8 grilled windows letting light in, which filter it. They let it dapple on the different facets of the Microrna, and the rest of it is lost towards darkness at the very top, but it gives a beautiful effect of the light being reflected off the different angles of the Microrna. Microrna domes, in fact, were very popular, expressed both on the outside of a building and the inside in Baghdad. And in fact, the tomb of one of the most famous Sufis of the time, Sohrawardi, in Baghdad, was with a Microrna dome like this. And Abd Samad, in fact, was a follower of Sohrawardi. It still wasn't this common in Iran to have Microrna domes like this. So there's a possibility that they picked this particular form to reflect his spiritual allegiance to his master. Not all that sure just how well known this kind of visual formal link would have been recognized, but there's a possibility that there is a link here. Unusual lack of color here, although probably you can assume that where there was stucco, it was always colored. I think the color has probably disappeared here. But the contrast may well have been desired between, say, the plain white of the Microrna at the top, giving perhaps an idea of spiritual purity, and then the color both of the original stucco inscription, but also of the lower walls. Now, sadly, just about all of the original tile work has been removed, and it's ended up in different museum collections in the West for the most part. In fact, you may have seen this too in the Met, because that's where it is at the moment, and it's probably on display again. This is one piece which, as far as we know, was from this particular mausoleum. And What's the size of it? I would say, no, these are large tiles. Actually, I'd say it's about this. Actually, maybe say from the floor, it might be about this high. Yeah, it's very substantial. And there were tiles around the edge as well. Kyrios, what's the date of this tile? There's a big clue staring you in the face. Read it. Okay, Sana is very clear, yes. Saba. Where? Sabamea. Yeah, 707. So it's written there for you, which helps. Little detail of the background decoration.
All the pieces are.
Yeah. Some iconoclast objected to having figural decoration in this context, and so hammered away all the faces of the little birds. So it just shows you, obviously, that what's permissible and what isn't changes over time. When it was built, they had no problem with having the heads intact. But at a later stage, no, for some reason they objected. What technique is the tile here? This is luster again, okay? This kind of brown sheen on top. This is the overglazed luster painting. Okay, this is the entrance to the Khanka. As it was before restoration, in the survey of Persian art, there are very good volumes of photographs that you'll find useful to look at. And that's before, and this is after restoration. You can see, in fact, almost all of the upper part of the Microrna decoration here is rebuilt. But here again, they're using just the two colors, light blue, dark blue, together with brick. But you can see the very different effects that they're able to get with this. Now here's the end of this inscription, which I've put on its side so that you can read it easily. So, Nada, why don't you, can you read this, the date? So you have Sana. Yeah, I'm sorry, the contrast is doesn't help. Yeah, there's it's Sita Ashra with Sobamea, in fact. But this is probably a mistake because you can see that the letters here are in much worse condition perhaps than these. And if I go back to here, the bottom of it was missing originally. So the minaret is dated later, but the original date was probably, in fact, the same as that of the tilework in the Mausoleum. So it's just a warning when you're looking at a building to see whether it's been restored or not, because even in restorations they can make mistakes. Okay, that's some of the most important buildings from the reign of Fuljaitu. We've seen a big increase in the use of tilework in particular in Ilkhanid architecture. We've seen a trend towards monumentality that would have been evident in the buildings of Ghazan Khan in Sham if they had survived. It's certainly evident in Uljaitu's Mausoleum. And we'll finish off Ilkhanid architecture then in the next class on Sunday.